Um, so this is going to be an interesting time here today. One, because there's a strange confession that I need to make, not about sin or anything, just about the biblical text and what it did this week to me. Um, the second thing is I realized I had laid a trap for myself without realizing it, and I fell right into it. And I've got to, I spent a lot of time this week figuring out how to back out of it so that I can go forward in a better, more strengthened position. Um, and I think I know what I'm trying to accomplish here. So that's all coming out here today. So let's start at the beginning. Um, as you know, I've spent a lot of time puzzling through the chronology of early church history. Um, there is something to be said for seeing space and time dimensions in the early church. And so it's not simply enough to look at a map of the Mediterranean world and here's Paul's first, second, third, fourth journey. But in a sense, you need to be able to flip it up 3D so you can see where the literature we have or know about was composed in a time, and then where scholarship tends to place it geographically. Okay, and all of this is, it may seem like silliness, and it may seem like minutia that is not going to be valuable, except that it seems to me more and more and more that the New Testament itself, as a collection of documents, is a referendum on the Apostle Paul. And I'm not saying that the literature in the New Testament is either for or against Paul. There are just lots of 50 shades of gray here apply. They really do. But the other thing that I think is important in this location or dating of texts has to do with, as I said, Ephesians. And those of you that were in the seminar I did where I contrasted the Thessalonian letters written in 41, at least according to Campbell and a number of others I've discovered this week, number of others. Campbell wasn't the first, and I don't think he says he was, but I've actually been doing some reading in this, so I've discovered, there are these others. And then 50, which is when the Ephesians, Colossians, Philemon are written. And then after that, and several months later, become the other great Pauline texts, the letters to the Corinthians and the Galatians and Philippians and Romans over the course of the next, 18 months or so. So between 50 and 52, there are these 8 authentic letters written, and then the 2 previous back here. And what I did was I contrasted the eschatology that's found in the Thessalonian letters with that of Ephesians, and really tried to demonstrate that the entire Hanukkah framework, the Second Temple Jewish framework of eschatology, had been abandoned by Paul. That's what he abandoned. That's what he left behind when he saw the implications of the gospel, not just for the Jew, but also for the Gentile. And he sees this because for Paul, the effects of the cross are the death of everything, And this is an epistemological event for Paul. It's the death of knowing the way we know, or the frame in which we know. And he says, I am crucified to the cosmos. And the cosmos, the way reality is structured out there, is crucified to me. We're dead to each other. We are speaking such different languages, and we're such different planets, we might as well not even acknowledge the other's existence, he's saying, in effect. So as I showed the difference between the Thessalonian letters and Ephesians, I grew more confident in the hypothesis that Ephesians was in fact Pauline. And as I've mentioned to you previously, the first 40 years that I've studied Scripture or more, I've tended to accept the non-Pauline character of Ephesians. And so as I began setting about to prepare for this week's talk, I'm going through the Greek text of Ephesians, just get really familiar with what's going on in the text, and I run across a conundrum. and it has to do with the word patria in chapter 3, which is only used 3 times in the New Testament, twice, once in Luke, once in Acts, and once here in Ephesians. And of course, you know my theory about Luke and Acts. Luke is written in the 80s and Acts in the late teens of the 2nd century, around the time of the Ignatian epistles, the pastoral epistles, 2nd Peter. At any rate, I'm dealing with this word patria, and it makes no sense. It just absolutely makes no sense to me what Paul could possibly be saying in chapter 3 when he says, for this reason I bow my knees before the Father, from whom every patria in heaven and on earth is named. Well, what the heck does he mean by every patria? Can't be, it's not nation, because we're dealing here with something that's bigger than a family but smaller than a tribe. What's he talking about? Every patria. It's not fatherhood. This is not like paternitas in Latin. There's no abstraction here, so it's not like fatherhood in general. What is a patria? Because it's if it's not nationalistic and it's not abstract, what is it? And furthermore, these patria seem to be located not just on earth, but also in heaven, in the heavenly places. Well, what are these patria? Furthermore, these patria have been named, but named by who? And named what? What are we dealing with here? Are we dealing with every authority? I mean, are we to think of this Enochic naming of all the different devils and demons that were part of the leadership of the demonic as it rebelled against the angels and were cast out of heaven in the Book of the Watchers? Are we to understand patria here as patriarchal authority? I mean, seriously, again, no, because it's not abstract, but when I came to this, it just laid me low, because I'm saying to myself, this just doesn't make sense of anything I can think of, especially in terms of Romans 9 through 11, where Paul talks about the nations. And so I started having my doubts about being able to develop the hypothesis I want to develop. And that hypothesis you need 3 legs. I need 3 legs for a hypothesis to work. It's like a 3-legged stool. And the first leg that I was using in my hypothesis was the F.C. Bauer's work, and but not his work, but the extension of it, the refining of it, the way like someone like a J. Louis Campbell or a Doug Campbell would use it, and that's the Paul versus the Jerusalem church kind of thesis, okay? Or Paul versus Peter, as Michael Goulder and Bauer would put it. Okay, that's one piece. Second piece has to do with a mimetic theoretical look at the early church, understanding that when we look at the development of the early church, we are looking at a mimetic conflict, a conflict over apostolic authority, who was a true apostle, what made an apostle, what kind of authority did they have, and where did they get it from? Okay, so we have these major valuations going on in terms of calling, mission, service. Then we have the theological issues related to Torah and whether Torah belongs as part of the apostolic message or it doesn't. We have the big question about how the Gentiles are included. And we have the Jerusalem church's solution in Antioch, and we have Paul's solution. And then there's the solution of the fourth gospel, which tends to merge well with the Pauline. And if you followed my work, you know that I tend to see the Johannine community in Ephesus and Paul. They're both, in a sense, dealing with the Peter James tradition, or at least the Petrine tradition, the authority of Peter. So as I'm thinking this through, and I'm asking myself, okay, now I've got the mimetic theoretical, the historical critical piece with F.C. Bauer. I need a third leg to stand on. I said, I'm going to make that third leg my ability to show that Paul had a second conversion. But as we got the road to Damascus thing going, but nobody that I know of has ever sat down and talked about the huge difference between Thessalonians and then the other Pauline letters in terms of their eschatology. They note the difference, but because they either date them in and around the same time as the other letters, it all gets jumbled. But even those that will date them earlier to the time of the Caligula crisis in 41, even those that do that don't seem to notice there's a big shift in Paul's thinking. Okay, so that's the third leg. But then here's the problem. What if I'm not convinced that Ephesians is Pauline? Well, now I have to send it in my historical thesis to around the year 120, when the book of Acts is written. And I have to see Ephesians, or understand Ephesians, as written by a faithful Paulinist. Okay? That's what I have to do if I send it around 120, a faithful Paulinist. And I can contrast that with these three letters that are written called Timothy and Titus, and really see how different Pauline communities understand Paul. And if I wanted to go further, I could go to the communities around the book of the Acts of Paul and Thecla, the more charismatically inclined Pauline communities. So Paul's communities did not develop all in the same way. They actually developed quite differently. And Paulinism, the effects of Paul in local congregations, by the early second century, we had different types of Paulinism. We even had the radical Paulinism of Marcion. Okay, so we could put Ephesians there. Okay, we could make real good sense of Ephesians there. Really, we really can. Again, because the correlation in language and thought patterns, particularly on what constitutes an apostle, is so similar in Ephesians and Acts. And we know there's no literary relationship between them, although, there's some folks that because of this overlap in thematic material and some vocabulary, some want to suggest that the writer of the book of Acts had Ephesians, a copy of Ephesians. But I don't know when and if or how long any of Paul's letters circulated by themselves. I don't see Paul's letters just being circulated by themselves. Somebody, perhaps Paul himself, made a collection of his copies of his own letters, and then those copies were made. But early on, there would have been a collection. Marcion did not collect the Pauline letters, as is often suggested. He inherited them already as a collection. So now what happens if I do put Ephesians, right there, and for that third leg of the stool? Well, now I have to be able to explain texts like 3:15, from whom every patria is named, because why in the world would Paul, if he's saying, this is my message, this is how I understand the message, this is my gospel, why would he use language like this that never gets developed or used anywhere else? So, and as I was just really, and you have to understand, this stuff creates agony in my soul. It's not just me. I mean, Cheryl can tell you, I lay awake at night there thinking about this stuff. I'm up at midnight, my head's going, it's really not fun, but it's the way it works. So I don't think I have a solid third leg to stand on, because Ephesians could be dated later. However, now here's where I told you there's the possibility of an out here. Here's the however piece of this. It has been demonstrated certainly by Mitten back at the early part of the 20th century, but others since then have followed up with this, that the overlap or the relationship between Ephesians and Colossians is a literary one. That is, one or the other is borrowing from one or the other. Okay? Now, the majority will say that Colossians was the first letter, and the writer of Ephesians, the non-Pauline writer of Ephesians, borrowed from Colossians. And that's why Ephesians sounds so much like Colossians, because the non-Pauline writer, let's just hypothesize around 120, has some Pauline letters. Well, we don't know what letters he might have, but he certainly has Ephesians, because 24% of Ephesians can be found in Colossians. That's a lot of text, okay? But then again, you can find almost the whole letter of Jude in 2 Peter 3. I go back to the tradition lecture I did the very first year we were together, where I said, all theological thinking is re-traditioning. We are always traditioning the tradition. Always, always. That's what we're doing, okay? We're re-traditioning the tradition. And we see this in the biblical writers. I mean, Matthew is not satisfied with Mark, and Luke isn't satisfied with Matthew. Deuteronomy is not satisfied with Torah. 2 Peter, Jude. We could go on and on in the biblical writings. The chronicler in relationship to Samuel and Kings, the Bible is a collection of literature it's interpreting itself as it carries on. It's this genius collection of literature that is constantly self-interpreting, asking questions about itself. I pointed out recently in a talk that we did on the podcast that there's not a solution to the problem of evil in the Bible. There are multiple attempts to find a solution. There's even nihilism. I mean, Nietzschean nihilism in the Bible, the book of Ecclesiastes. Absolutely nihilistic book. Eat, drink, die. That's about as good as it gets. Might as well be good while you're doing it, right? The Bible's it's self-referential in as much as it's seeking to continue to get to the heart of the matter and carve that out. And that's why the New Testament writers, I think, have no problem using other literature. So let's just say Ephesians uses Colossians. Okay, that's there we go. Ephesians uses Colossians. Now I've got to take the Thessalonian literature and put it up against the letter to the Colossian Christians. It is more of a challenge because Paul does not have as developed a view of world history, or he at least has not expressed that in Colossians, where he does in Ephesians, both the first chapter and the concept of the oikumene, as well as his global apostolic authority, his authority over the Gentiles. Whereas you don't have quite that earthly global view, but you certainly have a strange approach to Christology in Colossians, which at times it almost feels docetic, but I don't think it is, but it starts to feel that way, where Christ is the Pantocrator, the Lord of all creation. All things are created through him, whether in heaven and on earth, and so on and so forth. Okay, so we're going to have to suss out this. Here's the question. What do we find if we recognize that we're going to contrast the Thessalonian letters with Colossians, and we're looking at that gap? That's that third leg of our thesis, that there's a change there. And we could use Ephesians as potential corroborating evidence if we accept its authentic Pauline character, or if we place it down the line with the book of Acts. We are looking at Ephesians, Acts, and the Pastorals all being composed against a Marcionite view of the relation of apostolic church to the Jewish people. That is really starting to make a lot more sense to me. The Jew-Gentile gap of the first century is no different than the Jew-Arab gap of today. The animosity between Jew and Gentile in the ancient world is no different than that found in the Jewish-Arab world today, or the Jew-Gentile world today. I mean, Germany is a prime example, 100 years ago. Okay. This means that as we come into the era in that second century, again, I think about this, we would have an explosion of writing, and it would be in a sense, the third explosion of writing. So the first explosion of Christian writing occurs in the 50s, the early 50s. And in this, we've got the authentic Paulines, except for Thessalonians, which are in 41. That's the earliest. But then in the 50s, you're going to have the other authentic 8 Paulines. You're going to have First Peter. You're going to have James being published during this time. I've never settled yet on a date for the Johannine epistles. I think they are to be read in the inverse order in which they're written. So 3rd John is first, 2nd John is second, 1st John is first, and then sometime later the Gospel of John is written. That's how I see the development in that community. But whether any of this Johannine literature is written that early, I don't think so. I just don't think so. I think the Johannine literature is definitely post temple destruction, post 70 CE. Although, if you really want to have some fun, if you really want to mess with your head, pick up John A.T. Robinson's book, The Priority of John. Bishop Robinson, a great scholar. Different things could be said about his career in the 50s, 60s, and 70s, but just a really fine scholar. In his book, The Priority of John, he argues that John is the first gospel written. And he makes a great case for it. I mean, like an astounding case for it. And it's, even though I'm not convinced of the early dating of it, I am convinced of this simple fact as a result of reading that book. And that is this: the Johannine narrative has a greater claim to credibility for the historical Jesus than the synoptics. Now, that would send the Jesus seminar into a tizzy. But when you combine J.A.T. Robinson's The Priority of John with C.H. Dodd's classic book, the historical tradition in the fourth gospel, you'll come away sitting there going, yeah, the Jesus of the synoptic gospels has been apocalypticized. Now, this was a theme that Marcus Borg brought up in the Jesus seminar, and Walter Wink as well. And there were questions about, whether Jesus was apocalyptic as the synoptics say he was. I don't think he was, but I think he was somewhat, but not quite like the synoptics have turned him into. And remember, the synoptics are really the Mark and Matthean, Luke, and you really do see you have in Mark, you have a real apocalyptic Jesus. In Matthew, that apocalyptic Jesus is also an eschatological figure. It's not just apocalyptic, but now we're broadening this into eschatology. And then Luke turns around and ameliorates that whole thing, with a very much more kind eschatology, sans apocalyptic. So that's why you don't have that apocalyptic in Luke. And it seems to me that the early church in Jerusalem had plenty of reason to create an apocalyptic view of Jesus, particularly because of the sheer amount of persecution that they really did undergo for decades, up until and even through the expulsion from the city at the time of the Roman occupation in 70. One moment. Okay, so that was my big aha moment. I could use Colossians. Oh, okay, this is going to be fun. Now I go to Colossians. Okay, this is where I could use some help. So if you want to chime in, and Steph and others that are watching, if you all want to come in and help me suss this thing out, that'd be fine. Tom, you're welcome to, and you guys. So here's the deal. I go to Colossians. I'm sitting there, okay, I'm pretty familiar with Colossians, and I tend to think that the heresy in Colossians is not some kind of syncretism. I think it's a very specific form of Jewish Christian Gnosticism. I think it has real parallels to Samaritan Gnosticism, which is where Gnosticism really comes from, is from the Samaritans. Uh, um, but not that they all went that way, but that's where it comes out of the Simon Magus tradition, the Dosithians, and otherwise in the late first century. At any rate, you have this thing going on at Colossae, and he's gonna have to rebut it, okay? And you can start to see the inklings in that rebuttal of the development of a Christology that's really fundamentally different than the typical Jewish messianic from the tribe of David, came to fulfill the promises, is the Messiah. It doesn't. Jesus is the Jewish Messiah. Now, here we have this letter saying that he's more than just the Jewish Messiah. He's all kinds of other things too. And in Colossians, you can't help but notice that Paul, and you have to work with me here. Now, remember, we're working with the assumption Ephesians borrows from Colossians. So what do we find in Colossians? We find Paul at almost every turn looking at Greco-Roman categories and trying to fit the gospel into them. Think about this. You have the hymnic material in Colossians 1, okay? I told you when I was going to do a verse by verse on Ephesians, I don't think that's going to happen. We may end up doing an expository thing on Colossians, but we will do the hymn in Colossians. And when we do that hymn in Colossians, I am going to bring Walter Wink's research in that shows that this hymn is a Gnostic hymn that Paul's reworked, or at least the Gnostics have reworked the Pauline hymn. We'll say that much. But Paul's using traditional material here. Look at the virtue and vice lists. These things are good, these things are bad. Virtue vice lists are prevalent in both Judaism and Hellenism. And furthermore, you have the household codes, the house tefillin. Husbands, respect your wives. Wives, obey your husbands. Masters, slave. Children, parents. These Aristotelian household codes. And if this is the case where Paul comes out of this shift away from the second temple Jewish eschatology, and he leaves that behind. In the first letter that he pens, he goes right in and does with the Greco-Roman world what he'd been doing with the Jewish world. He starts borrowing all their categories and trying to fit the gospel into them, doesn't he? Oh, look, the Christians and Jews, we all have virtue advice lists. Oh, look, we've got ways that we want our families to run. Oh, look, we sing songs and have rituals. Oh, look. And so you see Paul, as it were, almost accommodating the gospel to these forms. But I don't know, because after that, he never goes near that again. Why? Now, if Ephesians is not Pauline, we put that out in the future, and we can say, okay, why did the writer return to those forms? But let's say it's Pauline. And so you've got Colossians and Ephesians, but you still have the same result. Paul doesn't do that again. He doesn't seem to turn to these cultural, social forms to say, hey, Christians do it this way. You say this is how we do it. He doesn't do that. I don't know why. Is it because he recognizes that to do that is to do the same thing as to try to fit Jesus into the Second Temple Jewish eschatological mode? Is that the same thing, except now we're doing it with Greco-Roman moral and philosophical codes and thinking? Is it that he might do it, or he could have done it, but those weren't the issues in the other letters? Well, I don't know. it seems to me that if the household code was something that was universal, it would have made its way into Corinthians for sure. I mean, Paul has to talk at length in chapter 7 of First Corinthians about marriage. It should have made it there, right? I mean, he talks about slavery in any number of points in his letters, but really not much about the master-slave relationship. But there seems to be no reference to this in Onesimus, or I'm sorry, Philemon, with regard to Onesimus. So I don't know. These are questions now that I'm really, really wrestling with. So I'm going to have to take my time here and try and figure out if I can make the third leg of the stool, the first one being the historical critical approach by Bauer and Campbell in that line of thought, the second leg being the mimetic theoretical, so I can account for the rivalries. I have to be able to account for the rivalries and the conflicts and the scapegoating. If I can account for that historically, that makes sense. Now, can I show that Paul had this huge change of heart? If he did, one of the big changes of heart Paul would have had is the same thing that's happening today. And that's that we're finally today challenging the doctrine of this eternal conscious torment like nobody's business. Okay. I don't know that there's been a time in the history of the church where there has been such a rebellion against this category of hell and eternal conscious torment, this visceral reaction against both the Calvinistic and the Augustinian forms of it. Second, we seem to be living in a time when it is recognized that a two-faced God just is nothing but trouble. And so one can either become an atheist in regard to all religion, because all religion is two-faced gods, or one can be permeated by the truth and the revelation that God is not two-faced, but of single character, and that character is love. The shift that's happening that I'm seeing out there, these are the two biggest moves, but then there are an awful lot of false moves that are being made in relation to these. One, the rejection of the so-called Old Testament, the Jewish scriptures, the rejection of any notion of divine progressive revelation or progressive understanding, or however you want to do that, which creates an anti-Semitism in Christian thought. That is a huge one, but the biggest one to me is the rejection now of the doctrine of the Trinity. It just seems so odd to me that the thinking, the real good thinking that's been done on the doctrine of the Trinity, not just in the 3rd century or 4th century, not just Nicaea. Nicaea is just a start, guys. It's just Nicaea, it did not answer the questions, okay? It said, here's how you can frame answers within this matrix, but it didn't give us the answers. It just gave us the frame. The 20th century conversations in and around the doctrine of the Trinity have been far more profound than in all 20 centuries of Christianity. So anybody that wants to go, oh, I'm going back to the early church for my doctrine of the Trinity, I just want to pound my head and go, you're going to, reinvent the wheel. You don't need to do that. We've already been through all kinds of viewpoints in the 20th century, from Barth to Zizioulas to Lacuna to Moltmann. I mean, we've done it. We've done it all. It's all there now. Here's the best parts of these, and here's where, the best thinkers are moving, and there's that trajectory. You can see it. So you've got a good, healthy Trinitarian trajectory. You've got I think a reasonably decent historical Jesus trajectory. You've got a fairly decent I want to say hopeful uh, um, non-anti-Semitic approach to the Jewish scriptures in mimetic theory. Mimetic theory, one of the beauties of it is that it doesn't scapegoat the text, and this is really important. Today, Christianity is being scapegoated globally. I mean, Christianity has been scapegoated since the Enlightenment. Christianity has been the celebratory cause of all things wrong in the world, and And of course, Christianity and Western Christianity is associated with being a white male, which we all are here, and so we become this scapegoat, this of global culture. That's to be expected. This is the thing. That's to be expected. As Girard pointed out, Christianity is the only religion that predicts its own demise. You go when you go back and you ask why was it? Why couldn't the gospel message just be as clear as a bell? Why from the beginning was it muddy? Well, it's because revelation doesn't change everything overnight. It comes through a cross, comes through blood, it comes through guts, comes through suffering, comes through time. And so there is no great big like Jesus rose from the dead and the world changed and everybody changed and we're all happy clapping. No. Here we are 2,000 years on, and we ended up taking this life, this immeasurable life, and turning it into a religion, and then creating around that a sacrificial notion that turned the Christian religion into every other religion. Everything was sacrificial, except the Christians said ours is true. We're doing the true sacrifice. We have the authentic sacrifice. The rest of you are all demonic and fake and everything. We got the true. And in reality, it was never meant to be that. As Renee says, it was never meant to be such a thing as Christian culture. That's an oxymoron. Okay. And all of the dominionists and everybody out there that want to change the world, they don't understand. The effects of the gospel do bring change. They break culture down. They point out culture's dependence upon violence. For example, everybody right now, take Israel and the Gaza issue right now. Okay. Everybody, whether they say it publicly or not, knows in their hearts how they're feeling about this. Okay. There are those that won't say anything against the Arabs or Iran or Hamas or Hezbollah because they don't want to appear out of touch. But they will be anti-Semitic. They will rail against Israel, and they'll say things like, the modern nation of Israel is not the people of God that God made a covenant with, and this and that and the other. And they'll ham and haw and make all kinds of. They'll seek to separate all kinds of things that can't be separated. On the other hand, you got those folks that are pro-Israel, that are anti-Arab, but they're only pro-Israel because they're freaking Zionists to begin with, okay? And so they're anti-Arab because they're American, usually American influenced, or at least influenced in some way by the totalitarian approach of Islam to authority. So you can think of the Uyghur problem in China, and Russia's also problems with Islam and some of its satellites. We these rivalries, folks. I guess this is what I'm trying to say. This conflict that is today is no different than existed in the early church. No different. Nothing's changed. Nothing has really changed, and therefore the Pauline gospel, whatever it is, or the gospel, whatever it is, can still have these huge effects, even and especially upon Christianity, because Christianity too is a sacrificial religion. And when the gospel has its effect upon Christianity, it deconstructs it and shows it to be useless and worthless. And that's where people are at today when they talk about the church, when they talk about Christianity. It's useless, it's worthless, it's irrelevant, it's, bop, 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 bop. That's the effect of the gospel on the sacrificial religion known as Christianity. But Christianity is not the gospel. Christianity is a historical form, I suppose, kind of had to happen in order for it to permeate the loaf, so that when it goes down, everything else is going down with it. Now, all that suggests to me is this. It's possible over the next 10, 15, 20 years, Christianity will have its 70 CE moment. I don't, again, I have ways in my head that I can play that out, but I certainly wouldn't say them out loud. But Christianity as a faith tradition could undergo a 70 CE type event. When that happens, there's going to be no more sacrificial protection left on the planet. None. And there will be nothing to hedge violence at that point. And the Nietzschean will to power will dominate us as a species. In the last 5 minutes, I am now going to tell you the conundrum that I've run across. So I'm working through Ephesians this week, and I'm looking at Paul's vision of the church. Paul's, okay, I've just said it might not be Paul's, but okay. So I'm looking through the writer's vision of history, the church. And when it comes to the church, I'm not seeing today what the writer wanted to see happen. You know, it's been 2,000 years, and I don't see that church. But I'm also beginning to wonder what happens when AI, which over the next 5 years is going to replace over 50% of the jobs on the planet. So that's not me, that's Wall Street talking. That's AI. Okay, 50% of the jobs. Everything's getting changed so radically, so dramatically in human society. What if at some point AI decides the human species is not worth keeping around? Then won't it be the case that our creation will do to us what we did to our Creator? So I have these questions. I wonder if the writer of Ephesians wasn't dreaming when it came to the church, or the unity of the church, or the apostolic character of the church. And I wonder what the writer of Ephesians would say if they were here today, and they saw, and they knew and understood, you know, the 20 centuries of Roman Catholicism and Orthodoxy in both Greece and Russia. They looked out at the 40,000 plus denominations that have been created by Protestantism and the sectarian movements, and they look and they see the things that have been done in the name of Jesus, from pogroms and inquisitions to holocausts and apartheid and slavery and death and oppression to anyone that the churches felt needed or deserved it. What would the writer of Ephesians say today to us? Or would he just put his quill down and say, I'm not going to bother writing? That's been my question this week, because I can't get my head around the fact that what the writer saw and what we have are so really, really different. Okay, so that's where I'm at this week. Okay, I thought I would take you on that little strange journey inside my head as I'm trying to put these puzzle pieces together, and some of you might be able to help. With that, I'll open it up for some conversation for a little while. My foot is feeling better each week a little bit. I've had it down this whole time, but for our conversation, I might just tilt sideways so I can put it up on the chair.
I got two comments and a question. Really pensive stuff, Michael. Thank you very much. I mean, this is just for inviting us into your journey. But I mean, this is some of the most pensive stuff I've heard in a very long time. Regarding the Trinity, that book that you referenced for me was outstanding. So I thank you for that reference. And I wonder if the other brothers might appreciate that reference too, if you can remember the title.
Which one?
Uh,
The Karkainen? The Veli-Matti Karkainen?
Yeah. Yeah.
Yeah, so Veli, Veli hyphen Matty, Matti, Karkainen, Kainnaen, something like that. But you type in Veli Matty, yeah, he teaches or taught theology at Fuller Theological Seminary. He's Danish. Has a phenomenal series of books, but one of them is on the Trinity. And in that book, he just kind of walks through the history of the doctrine. And in the first I don't know, 50, 60 pages maybe, is the early church. But the rest of the book is modern approaches to the Trinity. And it's just brilliant.
Yeah.
And you could, yeah,
Yeah. And very generously done too. Very,
yeah,
very candid.
yeah,
Very fair. But I really consider it one of my treasured books. So I thank you for that.
yeah.
Uh, out thinking out loud and musing with you. The Colossians questions. Okay, why did he write? You know, why did you write? What if, or what to what degree do you think, rather than an existential individual crisis for Paul, that it was could it not have been driven by a relational circumstantial crisis? Otherwise, all of our everything comes out of our relationships. You know, there's something in Colossae going on. There's people, there's conversations. So as you were talking, I was saying, well, what was the need that was driving these things other than I'm not saying concerned, but if we over existentialize it and over individualize it, I wonder if we're projecting kind of a lot of Western stuff on it. Could it have been driven by very circumstantial unique to Colossae that we may not even know about?
Um, I'm a little confused, Steve. Let me ask you this.
Mhm.
Are you hearing me say that the Paul's perceived existential crisis can be seen in Colossians? And you're saying, wait a second, there was a real issue there, and we need to get to the real historical issue.
Probably a little bit of the latter. Not denying the former,
Okay.
but
So the latter's where I'm working from. I'm assuming Paul's had his existential crisis in the 40s. He's
okay.
worked it out so that by the time he gets to Antioch, and when the Antioch incident happens in 48, 49, right in there, right before Paul leaves and goes back out on his missionary journeys and starts writing his letters. I think that he's already made up he knows where he is, who he is, and where he's going, and what he's been
Oh,
called to before Antioch. Because if he hadn't, I don't know that he would have had the guts or the courage to stand all alone by himself over against James,
mhm,
over against Peter, over against his friends, Barnabas, John Mark, Silas. They all left him. I mean, he was out there in the cold at Antioch all alone,
mhm,
you know? So I don't see him having that theological crisis. Then I see that as having happened and been solved. And it's so solved that he's willing to stand up for what he believes is the truth, even if it means standing alone,
mhm.
you know?
Yeah, I appreciate that. I'm with you on that.
On the
To,
Colossians piece, I don't know. I'm still puzzling and playing with the scholars on this like I do, and kind of reading some of where they're at on different pieces and things, but I'm still wanting to continually bring it back to the Jewish Gentile relationship because there is that problem in Colossae. You got some of the Colossian Christians now getting all fascinated with things like, ooh, new moon, ooh, Sabbath, ooh, this feast or that feast or whatever. You got them, they're being Judaized in a very subtle way. They're not being Jerusalemized, Judaized, but they're certainly being Judaized. And I think it's in a more Samaritan fashion.
and I agree with you on that too. I think the whole Jew Gentile thing is woefully underappreciated when folks read the scriptures. I don't think we barely have a framework for understanding of the human hostilities involved there.
Yeah, and I think, and then I think that's why anti-Semitism keeps going on and on and on. You know, I'm reading a new set of interviews by Renee, and in them he says that anti-Semitism is not just a historical problem; it's a theological problem. Well, Karl Barth said the same thing. He said anti-Semitism is the sin against the Holy Spirit.
Hmm.
You know, and here I am today, and I'm watching uh, uh, the anti-Semitism in the world just start rising, and when you can always tell when the human species is getting ready for an explosive bloodbath. This anti-Semitism is one of the leading indicators. As it rises, we're heading in that direction, and it is rising.
Thank you.
Yeah, makes me nervous.
Well, I've got a question about your stool, your three-legged stool here, and I'd like to ask whether you might consider adding either a fourth leg to
Yeah,
that.
yeah. What do you got?
Well, so I was recently going back and listening. I think it was a lecture 11.1,
Okay,
Jesus and the Scriptures.
okay.
I think it was something that it was called. And in that lecture, toward the end, you referenced a book that I haven't read, so it's kind of dangerous for me to ask questions about books I haven't read. But you described one by John Ritchie. It's called Jesus and the Transformation of Judaism, in which the author writes about how Jesus had to use existing language to create new categories for people. And so when you were developing these legs of your stool, did you ever consider using linguistic theory to describe?
No, that's great.
I mean, here you asked about, assuming Paul wrote Ephesians, using patria in a new way. Maybe was Paul using that word in a new way?
Okay. Thank you, Tom. Hang on, I got. Let me
Good
just.
question. Thank you. Good one.
I just want to continue writing this out so that this week I have. I know exactly what I'm looking for. Subverting language. Yeah. Okay. All right.
It just seems like it might be another solution to reordering all the chronology of everything.
Right. And I could tie that in with Paul in his theology of the cross for sure. Okay. I got that. Okay, wish me luck. I'll work on that. That sounds good. That sounds really good. It was I forget if it was Steph who said, has anybody got any, simple ways to explain this? What all I'm really wanting to do before I die is to be able to lay out that there is a simple way to look at this. And it does make sense, and there is a pattern that can be seen, and that pattern can be in biblical studies, philosophy, anthropology, linguistics, hermeneutics. That pattern can be seen in Jesus and in Paul and in Isaiah. And in other words, the pattern is there. It can be seen in Christianity, Islam, Buddhism, Judaism, all religion. The pattern is there. And if we can show that pattern is there everywhere, then I think we can help people learn to read the Bible differently, and approach the Christian faith differently. But again, I don't know what's going to be happening. Look, man, once there's no money and there's no church, church can't afford mortgages, church can't afford real estate, church can't afford heating and all that kind of upkeep that goes with buildings and maintenance and everything else, because there's going to be no money for that. There's going to be no more of this. I want to go be a minister and be a celebrity and all this, and that's all going to go away. And anything to do with the gospel is going to be disconnected from money. And we need that in the most worst way. We need the gospel to get set free from money in our culture, in our world. It got tied to money early on, either in the Jerusalem community, I think, with regard to their poverty or their issues related to tithing and temple, or we see it in the Gentile world in the second century, third century, where the Christian bishops are begging these wealthy Gentiles to give, just take care of people in the community. But nope, they're just like the wealthy people today. I mean, it's and again, I don't want to blame those that are wealthy, because it's not a general thing in a sense, but there is certainly a perception of that with regard to wealth. Yeah, gosh. Okay, so linguistic subversion. That is a great fourth leg. If you can think of a fifth leg, let me know, because I just think it's important to be able to see to see the Bible as a debate. It's inviting us to enter into a debate. It's inviting us to bring our religion to its table of revelation. You know, um, yeah.
You started off talking about patria,
hmm
but you never really developed what you thought it meant.
I haven't come to any conclusion, Mike.
Yeah,
I've
because
read the commentators.
yeah,
You know,
you
I
want to
looked
step
at I used my concordance, looked it up. Went to my lexica, looked it up. Uh, saw the three times it occurs in the New Testament, and just went, huh, what is happening here? What it is ain't exactly clear. you know? I don't know. That's why I don't know. I don't know what it means for every family in heaven to be named after the Father, let alone every family or patria on earth. It's like I'm sitting here reading this going, either the writer of Ephesians is on some really good drugs, you know, or the writer of Ephesians really understands reality in a way that I can't still wrap my head around.
Mm. When you were talking about the changes that are coming for the church,
Mm.
and I think for a lot of us, we have a sort of I suppose almost a love-hate relationship with the church as it is now.
Mhm.
And I just wonder whether in that word there's almost a subtle redefinition of Paul's understanding what the church is.
Yes. Um, for me, as I've read Paul uh over these 40 years, and I come to the word ecclesia and I go, okay, well, people like Ronald Hawk and the sociologists have pointed out that it's just the term for assembly, an assembly, a gathering, it's a gathering.
Yeah.
Does it have any relationship to the Hebrew or Aramaic notions of kahal, or like a gathering of like Pharisees together, or Hasidim together? Does it have what is it? How are we to understand it? But no matter how we do, the thing is, for Paul, this ecclesia thing is comprised of enemies. It's the ecclesia is enemies, Jews and Gentiles. They don't like each other. Why would they sit across from each other at a table? Well, the Jews wouldn't have it anyway. And the Gentiles would be pissed at the Jews because they were going, well, you're exclusive. I'm trying to wrap my head around what was in this writer's head, that he could see Jews and Gentiles eating at the same table. I said, to me, that's like, this last week, it just hit me really hard. And I felt sorry for the first time for the church. I really did, dude. It was like, I felt sorry for Christianity. I felt sorry for ministers. I felt sorry for the institution. And yeah, it was a, yeah, yeah. I have never hated the church ever, never despised it ever. I've always loved it, and been critical of it and concerned about it. But I've always loved the church and Christianity. That's the Catholic in me, I suppose. And the Protestant in me is happy to sit and knock it about a bit.
Yeah.
But this week I actually almost wanted to weep for the church. Just what it has become.
Yeah.
It's no longer about enemies. It's about only friends and only like-minded people getting together, you
Mm.
know. Um,
I also wonder, obviously you're focusing on Colossians and Ephesians, but I'm wondering whether you can't really get to the fully rounded thinking without at least taking into account Romans.
okay, so I've thought of that too, and what I've decided to do is, as I'm going to recognize that Romans, the Corinthian letters, and Philippians and Galatians, those five communities, each experienced some sort of an invasion of Judaizers, Christian Judaizers into those communities. Um, and I suppose even Colossians, but I don't understand the relation of the Colossian heresy to the Jerusalem church, and maybe there is no relation at all. There isn't any, because the Jerusalem church and the Samaritan heresy are just going to be very different to begin with. But is it not? Would it not be? Would it not be right to note that where you have the Judaism issues, where you've got all of that justification by faith stuff going on? Whereas in Ephesians and Colossians, we don't have that yet. We don't have Paul even thinking that way yet. He will only think that way when the occasion arises that he has to think that way, and then he's in that mode where he's thinking that way and writing that way. This is that thesis holds water if we recognize that the Corinthian correspondence was written before Galatians and Romans, and then Philippians is written last. That also holds, and that's also Campbell's dating on those. So yeah, these are good, great questions, great thoughts. I don't know. It's been a strange study week, a really hard study week. I haven't had quite a week like this in a long time. And I don't know if it's just my mental, physical exhaustion, and dealing post-surgical and kind of the big move. I made a big move in my life, as you know, and I don't know, am I exhibiting spiritually, intellectually, and existentially some kind of, inner thing that's going on just because I'm stressed? I don't know. I don't know. I don't know. But these are the questions that popped in my head this week, and as I was getting ready to put the notes together for my talk, I realized I can't go forward. I have to say where I'm at. I have to kind of lay out, this is the problem I'm in right now, and maybe by next week I'll have found a creative solution, or we'll find one together, or the thesis won't hold, or some of the thesis will hold and other parts won't. But this is why I like to teach before I write, because then I can work. I'm an extrovert, so I work it out like this is how I work it out. Um, so this is why I really do appreciate you all letting me hear and having you here to feedback to me. Yeah. All right. We good?
I think so.
Okay. Well, good. Um I'm gonna hang on. I'll just end the recording, but I'll share a little bit. Where's the arrow thing? Stop recording.